Thanks so much, Alegria. It's really nice to be here for the fall reunion. And welcome everyone, at least virtually. I hope I get to see you in person at the next one. I'm delighted to be able to talk to you today about what's happening in the fintech payment space. There's kind of a revolution going on, as most of you probably know. And I want to get your feedback as well. So I'm going to leave a healthy amount of time at the end for you to comment or add questions or give me your thoughts on where this space is going. It's actually very timely for me because I'm going to be talking to the GSB Trust in the next couple of weeks about the same topic, and I'm sure that you could give me some hints about the sorts of questions that they'll ask. I've been working in this area for the past years, both on research and policy work. And this year, it seems to be all consuming in terms of the policy work. I've been doing some work on stablecoins, on central bank digital currencies, and on China's central bank digital currency. And I can talk about that project work, but I want to jump into the substance of the topic and maybe give everyone a sense of why we're actually discussing this and what's wrong with the current payment system. Why is everybody so excited about upgrading it? For those of you that are working in fintech, you probably know that the protagonists in this story are always Alice and Bob. I think that goes back quite a few years from the computer science literature and cryptocurrencies. Alice in this situation wants to pay Bob the baker $8 for a loaf of bread. And the question is, how is she going to pay Bob? Now, today I'm going to be talking about general purpose payments and not as much about the wholesale interbank payment system and how that's also going through a significant upgrade, particularly in security settlement and cross-border payments. But if you have questions in those areas, let's discuss that, because actually I'm quite passionate about improvements that are happening in that area as well. I mean, for example, the Treasury market last year could have used a substantial upgrade in its payments and settlement system. And instead, we got a very significant problem in that market. But again, today we're going to focus on Alice and Bob. And most of you know that in most of the world, Alice would typically hand over paper money or more frequently a credit card. The credit card could be in her mobile phone wallet overlay, but it's still typically a credit card based payment. And it would eventually flow through the bank payment rails, like almost all payments in the current system. So Alice will send a message using her credit card or a mobile phone app, a tap, a swish, or whatever. And her bank will take $8 out of her account, send it through the bank payment rails, which is pretty complicated actually. And it'll get to Bob's bank in a day or two, maybe 3, but Bob instantly gets a message saying the money's coming, so you can give Alice the loaf of bread. That experience is working pretty well these days for Alice, but she doesn't really know what's going on in the guts of the bank payment rails that's costing Bob so much to take that payment, and is causing many other costs and delays that I want to talk about. So these payment rails are illustrated in this schematic. So Alice could be customer 1 of bank 1. She's the blue dot at the top left. Her bank is bank 1, B1. And Bob's bank is the green dot, B3, and he's maybe customer 7 of bank 3. And the payment is a deduction from Alice's account at bank 1. And then bank 1 will credit probably bank 3 through the central bank payment system, which in the United States is Fedwire, and it can also go through a private payment system and be merged and then flow through Fedwire. As I said, this tends to take a long time, and along these payment rails, there are various fees being extracted. If it's a credit card payment, the interchange fees that Bob has to pay are actually quite severe in the United States. I want to illustrate that in this diagram, which comes from the McKinsey Global Payments Report from last year. So it's a bit of a complicated diagram. I'm not going to go through every element of it, but I want you to focus on the left stack. That's the North American payment stack. I got the data from this report and recompiled it so that it's easier to see. And you can see that the payment stack for the US payment system, or the North American payment system, including Canada, is heavily on the consumer side, meaning consumers are paying a lot in the United States relative to the rest of the world, and particularly a lot for credit cards. So the interchange fee for the US is, depending on what card you have, it's $2 to $2.50 per 100, which is huge, actually, relative to the actual cost. Europe regulates interchange fees for cards, and it's much smaller. It's about 10% of the payment stack in Europe. It's on average 15% for the rest of the world. Not only is the US payment stack heavily weighted towards consumer payments, meaning the profit margins are bigger on the general retail side, it's also just bigger in total dollars. So you can see from the legend at the top that US payment revenues, and that's basically profits gross of overhead and other expenses, constitute about 2.3% of US GDP. That's huge. Probably many of you didn't know, if you're not a payments expert, that it costs so much to run the US payment system. By the way, paper cash also costs an enormous amount, and that's not counted in this diagram. Paper cash is also a pretty costly thing to do. The rest of the world, well, let's say take Europe, Middle East, and Africa, that's 1.7%. So the US payment system is a lot more expensive, and it's not really because it's that much better. It's because there are relatively high profit margins. So many have been calling for an improvement, and that's gotten off to a head start this year because of China's big news, its central bank digital currency, and the fact that China has already had extremely efficient mobile payment systems run by the two large fintech firms, Ant Group and Tencent. And Americans have been kind of commenters, at least have been needling the Fed and Congress and the administration, saying, gosh, if China can do this, why can't the United States do this? And it's gotten into a bit of a space race. But let's go to more on the fundamentals and talk about financial inclusion. And I've taken these numbers from the World Bank's Global Findex database. And I plotted on the vertical axis financial inclusion as the percent of households that actually have access to the payment system, whether through digital means or otherwise through banks. And you can see that in high income economies, it's typically over 90%. In developing economies, more like 60-ish%. China is quite high. India is quite high. Kenya is quite high. Those economies, China, India, and Kenya, have had the benefit of very effective mobile payment systems relative to the rest of the developing economy. And China's numbers are actually, if you updated this chart to today, it's actually much better. Moreover, the digital payment system in China is very advanced because of Alipay and WeChat Pay, the two private services that I mentioned a moment ago. So for example, if you're in a city in China, 95% of payments are being made, of digital payments, which are most of them, are being made by one of those two services. So they have a virtual duopoly on digital payments in China. One of the big pushes in the United States, in Congress and in the administration, is to change the US payment system so as to increase financial inclusion. There are about 5 to 7 million households in the United States that don't have access to banking, and about twice that many that are relatively weakly banked, meaning they have very costly or inefficient access to the banking system. So they're using special, expensive paycheck cashing services and remittance services that are extremely expensive. And the United States wants to do something about that. At the same time, the United States is dealing with the advent of cryptocurrencies, as you well know. And just recently, the president's working group is developing a report on what to do about stablecoins, which is a type of cryptocurrency that's commonly used for making payments. I'm going to get to those in just a minute. So we're basically on the edge of a major change in direction in the United States. And I'm going to talk about the options at the end, but let me just mention briefly. The one option is to improve the existing bank payment rails, make them more efficient, faster, cheaper, more widely available, and accessible to the underbanked part of the population. Another approach is to let fintech payment services, including stablecoins, compete with banks to make payments. And then a third option is to introduce a US central bank digital currency. Now, all of those have a myriad of design choices, or there's a big menu for each of those. And we won't get into all of it today, but I want to engage on some of those issues. If you look at Vietnam, that's a country that's ripe for leapfrogging all of these issues like Kenya did with fast, efficient mobile phone-based payments. So I expect Vietnam to happen very quickly. India has the benefit of UPI and Aadhaar, which in combination have made bank rail payments extremely accessible, cheap, fast, and easy to use in India, although that comes with the need for everyone to identify themselves, and sometimes Americans don't like to be putting their identities into a large data set. What about cross-border payments? Well, I'm not going to talk about that at length today, but if Alice, who's customer one of Bank One, needs to pay Bob in another country, let's say Canada or Argentina or some other country, then Alice's bank needs to find a bank that has correspondent banking relationships in Bob's country. That would be Bank 3 finding Bank 4. Sometimes those chains, those food chains of finding a correspondent banking relationship extend to 3 or 4 along the chain. And every bank along that chain needs to check the legality of the payment, and of course needs to check its well, to make sure that it gets paid for the payment as well. So it's very, very expensive and annoyingly slow. And I'm sure you've all dealt with that when you've tried to make a cross-border payment or a remittance payment. If we go the bank-railed route, we could do what's called a fast payment system. So the key defining properties of that are that it's available 24/7, 365. You have near real-time access to the funds by the recipient of the payment. And there are various design approaches. You can either do it where the payment is honored immediately, but the banks settle it up later among themselves and they merge their payments with each other. That's called deferred net settlement. Or you can have straight through real-time gross settlement, which seems to be the way that most fast payment systems are going. The United States is doing one of those right now. The Fed is introducing FedNow, which will speed up the bank rail payments and make them more accessible. Although if you want to get a payment service, you still need to go to a bank to get that service. And one of the reasons I believe that the US banking system is so inefficient at payments is that banks don't really have an incentive to make it so easy to move your money and so cheap that they will discourage you from using their services in a walled garden sense, and of course pay their fees and keep your money on deposit in their banks. You may or may not know that US bank deposit rates are extremely low relative to wholesale rates. That's a not very well understood point, that US bank deposits are very non-competitive in terms of paying you what they're getting for their money. So simply doing a fast payment system like FedNow is a big step forward, but in my view, it needs to be coupled by something that causes the banks to compete harder to offer payments more competitively. So here are some examples of fast payment systems. Korea was really one of the first countries to do this. Bank of Mexico has SPAY, which is very successful. Sweden has a private system. The United Kingdom has introduced a nonprofit utility. Singapore has fast payments, including cross-border fast payments that it's introducing. The the European Central Bank has its target instant payment system, or TIPS. And as I mentioned, the US is coming online with FedNow, probably in the next 1.5 to 2 years. So that's one approach. Another approach, as I mentioned, is stablecoins. And you can think Libra, but now it's changed its name to DM and it's been reorganized. Or you can think of Coinbase's stablecoin, which is called USDC. These are the two largest stablecoins. Well, Tether is the largest, but it's not as stable as, I don't include it as really stable. Although its price stays near $1, the assets backing Tether are very sketchy. But here's how Alice would get her stablecoins to make payments in the United States. She would go to her issuer, which could be her bank, or it could be the Facebook, which will provide it through its issuer of DM, or it could be at Coinbase. You'll get online and load your wallet with USDC. And so in this case, the issuer is taking $500 in regular money from Alice and giving her 500 stablecoins tokens. The issuer gives $500 to the trust that owns the assets backing the stablecoin, assuming there are assets backing it. And then the asset invests that money in the backing assets, which can be bank deposits, they can be treasury bills, commercial paper. In the case of Tether, the backing assets were basically a black box until there was litigation in New York State that forced them to disclose that it's mostly commercial paper and not as safe, perhaps, as US authorities might prefer. The trust will then use those assets to authorize the issuer to give the tokens to Alice. Now she can go out and send them anywhere using a mobile app or her internet online, and make payments or do peer-to-peer, pay for a cup of coffee, whatever she wants. Now, the authorities in the United States are quite concerned on a number of grounds. First, will the assets backing these tokens be solid? Second, will all of the money coming out of the banks cause a problem for the banks not having enough deposits? I'm actually not worried about that one. Another issue is, will the blockchain on which the tokens are issued be stable, operationally stable, and up 24/7, 365? If a lot of Americans start depending on stablecoins, the authorities are worried about that. So those are on the worry side. On the positive side, the advent of stablecoins may provide a lot of new opportunities to make new kinds of payments, like doing Internet of Things, smart contracting, programmable payments. And they may also cause more competition for banks, which I think would be a very good thing. The other element of the payment revolution that's going on globally is central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs. And in this case, Alice and Bob simply could have an account at the central bank. No, they would have an account at the central bank in effect. And Alice's message to pay Bob would simply mean $8 moves out of Alice's account at the central bank and into Bob's account. So that's very quick and easy. It would be super cheap. It would, in principle, be available to anyone, anywhere, on a simple mobile phone app or on the internet, by any other device, and make payments quite simple, although there are some downsides. First of all, maybe you don't want the central bank having to look after every single account in the United States, and the Fed might be worried about that. Secondly, the central bank is going to have to check on the legality of all these payments. That's a big operation. Moreover, in order to do that, central bank needs to keep tabs on everyone, and that's a potential concern for those worried about privacy. So this trade-off between privacy and legal payments is causing a lot of concern in terms of the design side of this. And I won't go into any details, but I hope you ask me about that later. I'll take one of the central banks that's investigating this and just discuss what they view as the benefits of or objectives of exploring central bank digital currency. So one is making sure that you're not relying on a flaky or sketchy payment provider, so resilient payments. I'll skip to 3. So you're supporting competition, efficiency, and innovation, meeting future payment needs, improving the availability and usability of central bank money, addressing the consequences of a decline in paper cash, which is an issue. What do you do once there's no more paper money? I went to Sweden recently, and they wouldn't take my paper Swedish kroner to pay my hotel bill. And then provide a better method for making cross-border payments, better, faster, cheaper. When we do see central bank digital currencies in practice, they're mostly going to be done this way, the way that China is doing it. So when Alice gets her central bank digital currency in China, which is going to be called eCNY, that means electronic CNY. CNY is the foreign exchange symbol for Chinese renminbi. Alice will get it from a bank, most likely, her payment service provider, and she'll send a message to her bank to tell the central bank to deduct 80 renminbi from her account, put it in Bob's account. Bob will get a message from his payment service provider that the money has been paid, and he'll give Alice the bread, and that'll all happen in a second or two. And by the way, China's CBDC is not done as a cryptocurrency or on a blockchain. It's a central database management system. And they're doing that in order to get sufficient speed, throughput of about 300,000 transactions a second. Although I think the cryptocurrency experts will figure out how to do it that fast pretty soon. Now, China's not doing this on its own. As I mentioned, banks are helping. Also, telephone companies providing the apps and software. And fintech payment service providers, the traditional ones in China, WeChat Pay and Alipay, and many others in the private sector. And this is like a likely private-public partnership in the United States as well. Although in the US, it's still only at the research stage. The MIT and the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston are collaborating on research led by Dr. Neha Narula at MIT. But for now, it's just research. There's no development. Many other countries, though, are developing central bank digital currencies. You can see in this chart from the Bank for International Settlements, significant increase in the last few years in the fraction of, in the number of central banks working on CBDCs. Some of them are only doing wholesale. Some are doing general purpose. Most are doing both. And most of them are still in the stage of experiments, research, proof of concept, and only a few are in development. As I mentioned, most cases you're going to have this hybrid system where Alice doesn't deal directly with the central bank. She deals directly with her payment service provider. And you need to make sure that the app that Alice gets for her phone is completely interoperable with the app that Bob is using. And that means very strong standard setting. So the design implications are they take time to develop. The privacy side of it, securing the data, securing the resiliency of the system operationally against outages, and also something to check on anti-money laundering and other illegal payments. All of that needs to be designed in a place like the United States. Here are some major CBDC developers. And as I mentioned, China has already done it. Officially, the release comes next year, but there are already hundreds of millions of people, well, over 100 million people in China have used it, and for a large volume of payments. Sweden has been doing this for development work for some time. Korea, Nigeria, Bank of Canada, I'm a Canadian, by the way. Canada has said, we're going to develop it now, but we're not going to release it until we feel that it's really necessary. And really necessary means maybe paper money will not be any longer acceptable, or maybe a private cryptocurrency that we don't want to have in our payment system is getting too much traction. So we'll try to head it off with a CBDC. I've listed some readings at the bottom. If you want to get in touch with me at any time and ask questions on the side or ask for some of these readings, let me know. You can always reach me here at the Business School. I'm getting close to the end of my prepared remarks, so I hope you're getting ready with your questions. I'm looking forward to your comments and your questions. So what are the policy options? And let's say for the United States. By the way, one of my projects with Dr. Elizabeth Economy, we're co-directing an expert group of 27 leading experts from national security, economics, finance, policy, former government officials, several former members of the National Security Council, former undersecretaries of the Treasury, former head of a central bank, so a lot of top experts. And our policy group is attempting to provide at least a roadmap for policy to the United States government. And we're focusing in particular on the implications of China's CBDC. A lot of people are worried that China may somehow take advantage of its central bank digital currency to get ahead of the US in a way that the US might need a plan to deal with. And among the plans are simply improve the US payment system, but also provide a central bank digital currency that would give the United States a leading position internationally in how central bank digital currencies are being used. And at this point, there's some disagreement among the leadership at the Fed about whether a CBDC development project would be a good idea or not, with some governors of the Fed saying there's no need, it's a solution in search of a problem, and one central bank governor saying that she can't get her head around the idea of not developing a central bank digital currency. So US policy, well, one approach, as I mentioned, you could use regulation and fast payment infrastructure to get a more open and competitive bank rail payment system, something that allows entry by fintech firms and basically reduces the walled garden effect around the banks. And fast payments, of course, providing the operational foundation. A second approach is to allow or even encourage compliant private stablecoins, subject, of course, to the regulations that you would need, including interoperability, so that people could exchange payments even if they didn't have exactly the correct apps. A third approach is to encourage not necessarily stablecoins, but other fintech payment service providers to enter the bank rail payment systems. And they could do that if they were to get accounts at the Federal Reserve. Again, it would be subject to strong compliance and interoperability standards. And then finally, the kind of the nuclear option, because it's such a big deal and it's so disruptive to banking and the payment landscape, is to introduce a general purpose central bank digital currency. And when I testified to the Senate Banking Committee this summer, I said you should develop, in my view, a central bank digital currency now, should begin developing it now, because it takes 5 or 6 years at least before you'll have a CBDC that you will know its costs and benefits. And if you wait until you think it's necessary, it'll take you 5 years from that point. But I'm hoping that option one could be enough so that it doesn't have to be run by the central bank. I fear, however, that a CBDC may be necessary. And as I said, I'm recommending that the United States pursue that immediately rather than putting it off. The Fed is about to release a white paper that's been delayed twice now because I think it's still making up its mind on whether, or at least what its stance should be. The white paper is only going to be a discussion of costs and benefits and a request for comment. But I think the Fed is genuinely uncertain about whether it's a good idea, and it's waiting for leadership from Congress and the administration on this. So with that, I want to turn it back to all of you. I feel like I've been running a monologue here. I want to hear what you have to say. I see some chats
Yes, we've had a lot of questions come in. Can we start off by setting a little bit of baseline knowledge for our audience of what is the difference between CBDCs and general cryptocurrency, such as Bitcoin, and how blockchain works?
Sure. Well, a CBDC doesn't tell you whether it's a cryptocurrency, meaning it's on a blockchain, trades as like a tokenized money, or whether it's just a central database management system like the one that China has. A cryptocurrency, as you know, is typically an asset, which is called a currency, but in some cases, like Bitcoin, you can call it a currency, but it's an extremely volatile asset. It's only used to some extent to make payments. Its other uses are mostly related to speculation. It has the advantage that it doesn't require a trusted third party, and that's a very cool design. And other cryptocurrencies, these are permissionless cryptocurrencies, also have this advantage that they don't require a trusted third party. Everybody is democratically just transferring money on the same blockchain, which is in the cloud somewhere. A stable coin is a type of cryptocurrency whose price is intended to be constant in terms of fiat money, like one for one, ideally. And right now, stablecoins are being used mainly as a medium of exchange in the cryptocurrency space. They're not yet being used much for general payments in the US retail markets, but they could be. So that's what I would say in answer to that question, but I'm happy to take a follow-up.
Well, related to that, we have somebody ask, could you comment on the valuation approach for non-stable cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin?
Okay, so it's a bit like gold. In fact, Larry Summers recently said it's the new gold, in the sense that it's worth whatever people are willing to pay for it, hoping that they can sell it later to somebody else who will pay more for it. And I think that characterizes most cryptocurrency investments. And they are getting very popular. I read a report yesterday by one of Stanford's former PhD students, Michael Schwartz, who's the chief economist at Microsoft, who feels that there's a tremendous amount of potential growth in the total market value of cryptocurrencies, not only for speculation, but because people want a place to store money that they don't want anyone else to know about. So right now they're using paper $100 bills or paper 500 euro notes or 1,000 Swiss franc notes. And that's pretty cumbersome and it's hard to transfer those. But it's working pretty well for the people that want to keep their wealth in a private form, and that would include a lot of criminals. But other than storing wealth privately, which is a bit illicit in many cases, or very illicit, or making illegal payments, Bitcoin and many other currencies are used for speculative purposes. And I think that's the majority of the transactions are people hoping Bitcoin will go up and they buy it, or they think it might be going down, so they sell it. It's extremely volatile. As far as valuing it, as I said, if you can put a price on gold, then you can put a price on Bitcoin pretty well.
What are the implications of all of this on money laundering?
Yeah, and let me couple that with a question I see, is Bitcoin really private? And so let's couple that with the issue of money laundering or ransom payments, which happened recently when a US oil pipeline was shut down and in demand by a cyber attack, and the ransom was paid in Bitcoin. So money laundering, ransom payments, and privacy. Well, it's not private at all. Everybody can see the blockchain. Everybody has full vision of Bitcoin on the blockchain. But of course, you don't have the name of the person. Like it doesn't say Darrell Duffie has 212 Bitcoin. It just gives the ISP. And so people can track what I'm doing via that. It turns out that the US authorities are starting to get pretty good at tracking payments of Bitcoin on the blockchain, and they actually tracked down the ransom payments and told basically got back several $1 million of the ransom. And more recently, a lot of Bitcoin was stolen from the blockchain, and the thieves were forced to give it back because they were called out and everybody knew, where those Bitcoin were going in effect, and were tracking them. So they basically gave most of it back. So it's not private. Paper money, if you really want to hide your wealth, is much more effective, except that you have to then guard it in a much more expensive way, and it's hard to move around the world.
What would back the US stablecoin, and what is the estimated cost reduction from the 2% of GDP?
Okay, let's talk about the backing. It's the same backing as paper money. So when the central bank issues paper money, there is no backing. It's just an IOU. So it says the Fed owes you, if you have a $100 bill, the Fed owes you $100. So you could use that $100 if you got enough dollars. You could use it to buy from the Fed Treasury securities through your bank or something like that. But there's nothing in the sense that there's no money or there's no gold in a vault or physical assets backing it. It's an IOU. Just like when you have money in your bank, there's no stack of coins or anything else sitting in the bank waiting for you to come and collect it. It's simply an IOU. And when you call the IOU, the bank says, okay, we'll pay you and we'll cash in something else to do that. So almost all money in the world now is in the form of an IOU, one way or another, and almost none of it has backing. Many years ago, fiat currencies like the dollar, and most currencies, in fact, had gold backing, but that was abandoned. The supply of gold became too limited, and in any case, the price of gold is too volatile to be a backing. The monetary authorities are able to keep the price of fiat currency reasonably stable. US inflation has been between 0 and 2% for about 3 decades. So it's with some ups and downs. Right now, it's a bit more than 2, but fiat currencies are very stably priced. So you don't need to worry about the backing for the dollar. Maybe if you were in Zimbabwe or some other country who has a history of very, very high inflation, you might be worried that there's nothing backing your paper money. So maybe you should trade it for something else, like a different fiat currency or gold.
Hi, this is Zach from Singapore. So I want to really ask you the question about the regulator and the regulation, because recently some of the government, Switzerland actually launched before, and the Singapore government also, the central bank just launched the digital payment token license, also try to address some of the AML and the anti-money laundering issue here. So what's your view on the regulator? What's the regulator role here for the regulating all those different currency?
The regulator really should be running the show because money is a public good. It's like the internet. It's like the internet. It's like the highway system, the air traffic control system. These are all public goods. They're utilities that we all depend on, and that any one firm or individual doesn't really internalize all the benefits of keeping money and the payment system stable and highly efficient. So the government really, or regulators really, have a key role in deciding on the design of the payment system and how to regulate its use. Now, that said, the private sector, such as yourself, Zach, you're the entrepreneurs that are working within the rules that the regulator sets. I know Ravi Menon at the Monetary Authority of Singapore. He's an excellent regulator, and I'm sure he and the Monetary Authority of Singapore are very effective at working with firms like yours. Singapore has one of the most advanced treatments of fintech payments of any country in the world. It's way ahead of many other countries. As you know, you have your fast payment system, which is very effective. And Singapore has a cross-border fast payment system now. And moreover, Singapore is considering, ahead of most countries, carefully what to do about central bank digital currencies. And I've seen some of their work on that. So you can be, I think, very confident that your country is doing a great job from the regulatory standpoint and making sure that citizens in Singapore have access to efficient payments that are safe.
So my question tags on to the last one, and that is, what are your recommendations for keeping the regulatory bodies relatively unpoliticized? Because now what we're talking about is who regulates and what's their agenda. So, because we're talking about things that have massive global implications as opposed to the typical geographically centered fiat currency.
Yeah, Bernard, I totally agree with your comment. You want the regulators to be non-political and also aligned, so they need to have a plan. And that plan is first up to Congress, which authorizes the administration to design the plan. And the United States is behind, and Congress and the administration have agreed we are behind. They're very explicit. They have said we should have already known what to do about stablecoins and cryptocurrencies, but now we're catching up. That's basically what's happening. And you have a little bit of, it's not just the regulator in the US, it's many regulators. So the Securities and Exchange Commission under Chair Gary Gensler is taking a lot of action under the authorities of the securities regulations. Other regulators are taking a bit more time to be thoughtful about it. The Fed is, in my view, being so thoughtful that they're falling behind even further. And they need to move along. I've had notes from people in Congress, I won't name names, that have suggested that the Fed should be moving along faster on this. And Chair Powell of the Fed has said he's genuinely uncertain whether the US needs a central bank digital currency. And as I mentioned, several governors of the Fed are kind of in pointing in different directions on this. So the Fed needs to move along as well. But I think the Fed is waiting for guidance from the administration. So I think President Biden's administration will be providing guidance on this issue in the near future. And then the Fed will move, it will release its white paper, get comments, and decide what to do. Will they allow stablecoins? Don't know. Will they promote development of CBDC? Don't know. My suspicion is, though, that they will try to do better with the bank rail payment system, and maybe they will make the case. We don't need all that new stuff. What we need to do is improve the old stuff. Put in fast bank rail payments, do a better job on competition with banking, and let the banks run this. They have done a reasonable job on anti-money laundering. They've done a reasonable job on protecting your privacy. In my view, they've done an unreasonably bad job on competing with each other to give you good services at low prices and to innovate with smarter payment systems. And as a result, here we are today, way behind in the United States. Every economist and every regulator that I've spoken to agrees that the United States is further behind than any other major country in this area.
Hi, so it's Mark Louie, and Professor Duffie, I will confess that this is an area that I'm still trying to get my head around, so I may have some fundamental misunderstandings of how some of this works. But to me, a central bank digital currency is just an electronic form of another fiat currency, like a paper currency. And so in my mind, notwithstanding the fact that there's a lot of design issues and regulatory issues and whatnot, it seems to me, and this is, an editorial comment from somebody that's not very well informed, to be the natural extension of what the Fed does in terms of the paper money in the system. So I find it attractive, or at least interesting from that perspective. The issue really is what it does to the existing commercial banks, both in the US and elsewhere, because as a consumer or as a businessman, I could see that if I was able to transact at the central bank, as much fun as the guys at Chase and Wells Fargo are, they would become disintermediated in probably less than 10 seconds. And so I guess the question that I've got for you, and I'm not really sure it's the right question, is what does this do to the commercial bank infrastructure, if you will? What does it do to the profit model of a commercial bank, to their balance sheets? And there are other values that commercial banks have in the economy in terms of conducting monetary policy and multipliers and all sorts of other things. And so it seems like I'm fumbling, but it seems like such a radical reordering of the financial system that I just have trouble getting my head around it. Anyway, I'm not sure where the question is in there, but I'd love to hear your comments.
Well, Mark, you've nailed it. That's the $64 trillion question that you've nailed. We have a weak payment system because banks don't have incentive to make it better. And if the alternative is everything is done at the central bank, that disrupts the entire banking system. And so you've got these two extremes, both of which are not that attractive actually, because, I mean, central banks are very effective at what they do, but they're not noted for facing every single citizen in the country with retail services. And they might mess that up. They might mess up your data security. They might have an operational outage and oops, nobody can pay anybody. So we don't want to go whole hog all the way to the extreme. The midpoint, and if you go the other way, of course, if you just say, well, we don't want to do that, we'll just let the banks continue as they are, that's also terrible because, as I mentioned, we have a decrepit payment system, if you ask me, and I think most people would agree with that. So what's the happy medium? The happy medium is either regulate the banks harder for competition, allow entry by fintech firms or force banks to compete harder and open up banking services at lower cost, or introduce a central bank digital currency that's not the extreme version that I just described. It's a version in which the banks and other payment service providers are facing you. They are designing the software that you are using on your mobile phone up to a uniform standard of interoperability, and they are responsible for monitoring your payments for legality and protecting your data, just as we have today in terms of monitoring. So I would guess that the US government is going to figure this out, and they're going to take one of those two approaches. A, fix the current bank rail payment system, or B, introduce a hybrid system in which the banks are still running everything, but you're using central bank money. And going back to your question, Mark, even that will be disruptive to the banks, because if you're using central bank money a lot, that means you're not using your bank deposits to make payments. Banks will have to go out and get their funding on the wholesale funding market to a greater extent. The cost of their funding will go up. Bank profitability will go down. That's a commonly agreed thing. And then we need to think about, will that affect loan provision? Will banks then not want to make as many loans because now their deposit funding is more costly? And there's a massive debate going on in that area as well, where there are some that say, well, banks will become less profitable, but they weren't offering any loans at a loss, so they're going to continue making the same loans that they were already making. And others say, well, you don't get it. I mean, I'm one of the former camp. Others will say, you don't get it. If you cause banks to have to pay more for deposits and compete harder, they'll be more reluctant to make loans. So that all has to be sorted, and it's no wonder the Fed is having trouble making up its mind, but it's going to have to make up its mind pretty soon, because not only is there a benefit to making a choice, everybody now is commenting, and the Fed is under pressure, the government, and therefore the administration is under pressure to resolve what's the best course to take. And this has all changed. If you ask someone 5 years ago in the government, should we introduce a CBDC? They would say, well, not really, because there's nobody really needs that. Now everybody in the government is saying, oh gosh, that's a really tough question. I don't know, but we should try to solve that right away.
Yeah, hi, Professor Duffie. My question follows on Mark's question a bit on the big picture macroeconomic effects of having a central bank digital currency. And I'm wondering, from your view, what are all of the other areas where having almost instantaneous transfer of money is going to be disruptive? Because, for example, in the securities markets, we have T+2 settlement right now, lots of security fails, and of course that just moderates the velocity of money by having this 2-day settlement inside of the securities markets. And you think about how households have their paychecks going into the banks, and then that also mitigates sort of how fast they can be transferring money. So what are your views on having reasonably constructed central bank currency, as you had said, either through banks or directly? What would macroeconomists need to factor in that is a new world in that situation?
Well, that's a super good question, and it's another one that's fostered a huge amount of debate. So it sounds like you might have been working on Wall Street, or you might be working on Wall Street. It's set
I'm a securities regulator.
Yeah, okay. Well, then you know the famous saying on Wall Street, that nothing good happens between the time at which a trade is made and the time at which it's settled. In other words, if you can, settle trades faster, because then you're not exposed to counterparty risk. And moreover, the money that you have tied up and the securities that you have tied up until the settlement is done are trapped or committed, and you want to get those released as soon as possible so that the system is more liquid and efficient. The counter argument to that is, first, well, if we do instant settlement using blockchain technology, which is now possible, then everybody that wants to buy securities will have to have the money lined up before they make the trade, because it's going to settle instantly. So you got to be ready. And the other concern is that you want to make sure that the blockchain architecture is really, really solid. And I suspect that that problem can be circumvented. Last March, since you're in securities, you know that settlement failures soared in just 3 weeks last March. 3 weeks alone, $1.5 trillion of Treasury securities transactions were not settled on time. They failed. And that was really a light bulb went off in Washington and said, we got to do something about the settlement system in our securities markets. And I've been advocating, first, central clearing, so that you're not depending on your counterparty directly. You have a clearinghouse that guarantees the payments, and then investigating blockchain settlement that would allow faster settlement. And I've been working or writing a paper with Digital Asset Holding, which is a blockchain settlement company, a Wall Street firm, a fintech startup that's doing wholesale security settlement. And you can find the paper on my website. And CBDC, if it's done in a blockchain, would accelerate that, because it would make it possible to do instant settlement on the blockchain if you securitize, if you tokenize both the securities and the money. And you could do it with CBDC, or you could do it with a private stablecoin. Doesn't have to be retail, it could be just wholesale. And a lot of countries are doing just wholesale. Switzerland, Canada, Singapore, a number of countries are exploring just wholesale CBDCs because of this issue, although there's no major breakthroughs yet.
Yeah, nice to see you again, Professor.
Yes, I remember you from my class. Good to see you, Igor.
Good to see you. Yeah, I'm. As you know, I was working on the cryptocurrencies and CBDC infrastructure for a while now. So what I see from my point of view, like from crypto world, so right now there is emerged like a kind of meta banking thing. It's when the people earn money and receive the money in their crypto space. And what do you think, like, so this means that there will be opportunity for something like financial institution that works not under one jurisdiction, but kind of meta layer above all these jurisdictions. And what do you think, like in different countries, the governments, they will fight it, they will adopt it, they will kind of plug in, or maybe they will create their own kind of meta financial institution. So what's the plan?
Well, China is going to block it. The United States is still deciding what to do. For those of you that are not following this, what Igor is talking about is called DeFi, decentralized finance. And almost everything that you can do in traditional finance, which is called TradFi now, you can also do in the cryptocurrency space using blockchain-based systems. So you can borrow money, you can invest in cryptocurrencies, you can make payments, you can sign derivative securities, options, forwards, futures, all kinds of, basically all the major things that are happening in traditional securities markets like Christina was talking about, and money and banking, you can now do in the crypto space. Recently, the Securities and Exchange Commission of the United States threatened to sue Coinbase over its proposed lending of cryptocurrencies on its service. And Coinbase initially bridled at the idea that what they were doing was subject to SEC regulation. But generally speaking, it's not a good idea to go up against the Securities and Exchange Commission, and Coinbase has backed down, and they're going to comply. They're not going to release their lending, cryptocurrency lending program But off the, outside of the regulated sphere, as Igor suggested, globally, most of these activities are not regulated, and they're going to be brought into regulation country by country. And my suspicion is that the United States will say something like the following: okay, you can do all this stuff because we already let banks and securities firms and others do it, but you have to meet exactly the same standards. So you have to have full compliance, you have to do full anti-money laundering, you have to do full auditing of all of your customer accounts for what Christina may know is a 15C3 requirement, so that you're protecting your customer account money. You have to do everything, the whole 9 yards of regulation for banking and securities. And there may be additional regulations laid on top of that that will mitigate some of the concerns associated with anonymity or illegal payments. So I would anticipate, Igor, if you have friends that are doing this, that they'll be able to continue to do it, but they're going to be required in the United States and in some other countries to meet the whole gamut of very, very rigorous regulation. Right now, if you ask stablecoin developers like Diem what they most want to know what are the regulations going to be. They say, fine, bring it on, but tell us what the regulations are going to be, and then we can make our business plans and get money and raise capital and innovate. But until we know exactly what this regulatory landscape will look like, it's very difficult for us to move forward. And that's why the United States needs to move on this pretty quickly. And the administration and the regulators are moving, and they're meeting. It's a hot item in Washington. Everybody that I know in all of my contacts in the agencies tell me that it's a very hot issue in Washington right now, partly brought on by China. The United States does not want to get left behind. I think it's enough. Forget about China. I mean, that's important, but it's enough just to address the US payment system to get this right. Thank you for the very perceptive questions. All the questions that you asked were fabulous, and I'll go through the chat if you'll send it to me.
Absolutely. Thank you to everybody for joining us today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of Reunion and Virtual Alumni Week. Thanks.